Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Shapiro. I have the pleasure of being the organizing director at Women's March and the sort of spotlight host for this week. Again, this is the 5th of 8 web episodes. We are super hopeful that you can join us for the next 3 weeks. If you are able, same time, same channel. And last week we met with Normir, the wonderful Normir and the wonderful Paulina Helm Hernandez in a conversation around defiance. If you missed it, you can check out last week's episode as well as all past episodes because they're all super juicy at womensmarch.com/feminist futures. So over the next few weeks, we're going to continue to explore the age-old questions of how do we get here in this moment and where do we go from here? So we're going to listen to and learn from feminists across history who have navigated these waters or are navigating them in our little boats right now. And we're going to radically envision together where we want to go from here. I'm super excited about today's session that's about specifically women's work, but more broadly, actually around a feminist economy and the question of labor and gender overall. We are going to be led and joined by the wonderful Carinne Luck and the fantabulous, if that's a word, Lydia XZ Brown. We'll continue to explore where and how you fit into the stories and teachings Carinne and Lydia are so generous to share with us tonight. So again, thank you for being here with us. Stay tuned, and we're going to start really soon.
Hello.
Hey, Carinne.
Hi, Lydia. How are you?
I am doing okay. I mean, as okay as we can be in a literal fucking climate catastrophe and COVID and not just a general white supremacist hellscape, but other than that, doing fine. What about you?
I like to say, yeah, like right now, that's how I often do it. Like right now, I am feeling really happy to be here with you and with everyone that I'm seeing from all sorts of different parts around the country joining in. Lydia, do you want to begin by introducing yourself and then I can do a wee bit of that?
Sure. Lydia XC Brown. Pronouns are they, them. I'm a youngish East Asian person, short black and teal hair. Today I'm wearing a dark red hoodie and I'm sitting in a room that's got a bunch of books, random shit on the walls. I guess it's not really random shit, it's my shit, but I think it was random shit and a couple pictures behind me. And I'm joining from unceded and occupied traditional lands of Piscataway and Nacotchtank peoples, the Washington, D.C. area. And I have been a community organizer and an advocate in disability justice spaces for over a decade now. And my work focuses particularly on issues of interpersonal and state violence that target multiply marginalized disabled folks. And that means disabled people who are contending with the legacies and the ongoing violence of colonialism, of racism and white supremacy, of gender-based oppression, and so many other experiences of systemic and structural exploitation, deprivation, and oppression. And right now, I'm working in a couple of different areas. I am presently doing work on algorithmic justice and disability with the Center for Democracy and Technology. And I also lead policy work for the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. And I teach. I teach at Georgetown and American universities, where I am pretty much a nightmare for the right wing.
I love it. Thank you, Lydia. My name is Carinne Luck. I like youngish. I'm also youngish with sort of brown and highlighted blonde-ish curly hair, shoulder-length hair. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, Lenape land. I'm wearing a blue collar, sort of denim dress. And my background is the two halves of my apartment. One background is green with a bookshelf and a plant, and the other is white. And I'm an organizer, and I'm a trainer, and I work with various different movements and organizations and have done for about the past 20 years, really supporting people to find their leadership, to learn from lots of other movements, right? To me, so much of the feminism is about knowing that we have lineage, and that we don't have to like reinvent the wheel all the time. And so I've organized, I've worked with the Women's March, with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, with the Faith Matters Network, with the Working Families Party. I like to say, put me where I'm useful, and I hope I can be a nightmare to the right wing. That's an aspiration for me, Lydia. I'm happy to do a little bit of framing if that's useful.
Yeah.
Around our topic. Great. So I'm so excited. I'm like so excited about this topic. I feel like I could just like, you know, and just kind of jump in.
Honestly, we could probably talk for like 8 hours, and I don't know if anyone would be willing to listen to the two of us for 8 straight hours, but between us, I feel like we could make it happen. Like, I'm an autistic person of color from Massachusetts. We talk fast, we talk a lot. Like, we could keep this going for quite a while, but like, we won't do that. We promise. We're not going to torture y'all that way.
Unless, you know, there's a demand, but not here at least. But so to sort of just frame the thinking around what the sort of gender and labor and the feminist economy, the sort of 3 things that we've been thinking about and stories that we can anchor ourselves in, but really we can go anywhere with this. But one is thinking about how in the context of work, that we're a feminist economy, a caring economy, an interdependent economy is one that values all work, right? And that doesn't degrade or diminish work. And so we'll talk a little bit about how some work does that and how that work that's a non-feminist economy approach. Similarly, and sort of following from that things that we believe in a feminist economy comes from a place that isn't driven by like zero-sum games, right? And in fact, there cannot be justice, equity, freedom, flourishing, thriving when it's only for some, right? And when some people are left behind. And it's often people are pitted against each other as if it's a zero-sum game. And the third thing is that this is about power and collective power and intersectional power. And so that's also what we're going to be talking about. This is a feminist lens, a feminist-driven economy, culture is one that cannot be about the individual as atomized sort of beings. So those are some like top lines that we'll be talking about. Do you have thoughts on that, Lydia? I mean, I know you do.
You know, like a million thoughts, right? And one of the first things that I want to just completely get out of the way, right, and talking about care work and talking about the framing of this conversation is what exactly we mean by gendered work, what we mean by gendered labor expectations, and what we mean by care work. Because a lot of folks have a misconception, right, unless they have an explicitly anti-ableist, anti-racist analysis, that when people are talking about care, they're only thinking about wealth-privileged, non-disabled white women and what white women are doing. But women of color in Black, Brown, Native, and Asian communities have always been at the forefront of organizing around labor. That disabled women have always been at the forefront of organizing around labor. That a significant proportion of care workers who are providing care for children, who are providing care for disabled folks who need support, who are providing care for elderly folks, are in fact disabled themselves, are often disabled, are often intergenerationally impoverished, are often also Black, Brown, and Asian, and may often be immigrants, right? And so that's who we're talking about. And the fact that we talk about labor as being gendered is because in our current ecosystem, in the world, the society in which we live, we have a lot of assumptions about what kinds of people are supposed to do what kind of work, and in fact, what counts as work. And care work is work. And a lot of us have been responsible for providing care, whether in a paid way or in an unpaid way, informally, to our own family members, to partners, to community members, and we're not often paid for that work, and yet it is work. It is very hard fucking work. And in our society, because it is so profoundly white supremacist, so profoundly ableist, so profoundly capitalist, we value people based on productivity, based on industriousness, based on labor. But it's not just whether someone is productive, but there are also questions about how is someone productive? What kind of work are they doing? How much of that work are they doing? How often do they do that work? How quickly are they doing that work? And people from marginalized and oppressed communities fail those tests for whether or not we count as valuable people, because work providing care has always been gendered as the work of people who aren't men, whether they are women, they are feminine, or they are forcibly gendered as women, even if that's not actually accurate as to the person's gender. Because doing care work has always been dismissed as work that is either unnecessary, not legitimate work, or work that is spent and wasted. That disabled people who need a significant amount of care in many different ways and many different types of care, our lives are dismissed as not worth living. And if our lives are dismissed as not worth living, our existence dismissed as literally some kind of waste of space, then the care that is provided to us is devalued. And at the same time, people who need care, particularly care that is not already invisibilized and rendered as that's normal, everyone needs that, so we don't think of it as care work. People who need specific forms of care, like help changing, help eating, help with medication, help with cleaning a place because their disabilities or other conditions mean they can't do it, we are made to feel ashamed for needing care, that we're the problem, that we shouldn't have care. And so, to say that care work is real labor is to name both that we all deserve care, we all need care in different ways and in different amounts at different points in our lives, and we, societally and culturally, do not legitimize the labor that goes into care, largely because of who is primarily responsible for providing care and who primarily needs care.
Ooh, yes. I'm thinking of a couple of things. One thing I'm thinking about that folks may or may not know is that in this context and when we think about care intersectionally, when we think about how intersectional oppression is, right? The domestic work itself has literally been undervalued, literally been dismissed in our country's labor laws because of the legacy of slavery. And I don't know if folks know that in the 30s, as the legislation around the New Deal was being created, the Fair Labor Standards Act was initially perhaps going to include domestic workers and agricultural workers. And it was senators in the South, Democratic senators in the South, who opposed that, and who FDR gave them that. They gave them that. They were because they did not want their former slaves and slave people. They didn't want that community, that group of people, to have a fair wage and other labor laws. And so literally some of that has now changed. In the 70s it changed again in 2013, but we're not all the way there still today. Domestic workers still today don't have the exact same protections and have often been compared to babysitters, have been companions, right? You try taking care of someone who's it's not, companionship is gorgeous, but it's not just that, right? It's some of the hardest work. So the work of actually and the women, both in leadership and the domestic workers who struggle every day with the Filipino Workers Center, with La Colectiva, with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, they're undoing the legacy of slavery. And when we join that fight, we're also undoing the legacy of slavery. So it's ableism and white supremacy just so clearly intertwined there. And that's something that really comes to mind as you're talking, Lydia, that you can't separate out these historic and ongoing oppressions from each other.
we're actually getting a question from someone who's asking what exactly does intersectional mean in this context. So I
Great.
think we should, take a minute and address that, right? So I use that word a lot in my work and in framing my analysis. The word intersectionality was popularized through the work of Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who is a scholar of critical legal theory and of critical race theory. And Kimberly Williams Crenshaw used the word intersectionality and started using that term to describe what happens when more than one form of oppression collide and compound one another. The examples that she wrote about in the original paper in the early 90s that gained a lot of attention were how our existing civil rights laws fail Black women in particular. And specifically, Black women who would face discrimination at work that seem to be very much based upon both their race and their gender, the specific combination of being Black women, so different from being white women, different from being Black men, and different from being Latina women, different from being Asian women. So specifically, discrimination that they faced for being Black women wasn't legally recognizable under the law because our civil rights laws contemplate being discriminated against for one category at a time. That the law could say you were discriminated against on the basis of sex or you were discriminated against on the basis of race, but not both. And because the woman that Professor Crenshaw wrote about had experienced discrimination because of the specific combination of their specific race and gender, that is being Black women specifically, they couldn't prove under the law that they had been discriminated against. And so that experience of oppression by having a compounded experience of marginalization, we can understand it through a framework of intersectionality. It has embedded in the word intersection. What happens at the intersection of more than one form of oppression? And, just to talk about that, right? Like, how does that show up in other contexts? My work is rooted in disability justice, and I spend a lot of my time explaining to people how ableism and racism work so closely in tandem. And so many disability justice workers and thinkers have written and talked about this in so many different ways. Mia Mingus, Talila Lewis, Azaa Tarifi, so many folks, right? So ableism and racism work together. Because under white supremacist ideology, the ways in which disability shows up for white disabled people versus disabled people of color, not only are they often caused in differential ways, that disabled people of color might be disabled because of lack of access to pregnancy-related health care, because of less likelihood of having access to safe and nutritious food, because of active trauma and violence inflicted because of racism that causes disability, because of police violence, because of impoverishment, because of so many things that are more likely to happen if you experience and are targeted by racism and white supremacy. But also, ableism and racism show up in how differentially white disabled people and disabled people of color experience ableism. White disabled people are more likely to deal with the type of ableism that medicalizes disability and attaches to it pity. Your disability is this health problem, needs to be fixed, but don't worry, we'll help you. We'll give you accommodations, we'll give you services, we'll give you care so that you can be helped, but out of pity, out of charity, out of condescension. And meanwhile, disabled people of color, especially Black, brown, and Native disabled folks, are more likely to face a form of ableism that will say, well, if you are known to be disabled or believed to be disabled because you have a mental health disability, because you have a developmental disability, or because you have a physical disability, it's probably because you're a violent, scary person. It's probably because you are a person that is a threat to other people. In fact, your existence needs to be managed or controlled. And that disabled people of color are more likely to experience the ableism that might, again, be medicalizing and say you have a problem, but it needs to be fixed because you are dangerous to other people, because your existence is a threat, or it makes us unstable, it makes us uncomfortable. And so that breakdown of how ableism and racism can operate together, both in terms of how white people versus people of color experience disability, and as to how we experience ableism, helps us understand what intersectionality means. It means understanding that when we talk about oppression, they don't exist in a vacuum. When we talk about privilege, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The white privilege of white people with college educations looks different than the white privilege of white people who dropped out of high school and come from generationally poor families. Like, it's not the same, right? And that experiencing different aspects of access to privilege or resources or experiences of marginalization and oppression means that your personhood is understood differently, that your labor is judged differently, and that your ability to be able to move in or out of different categories of privilege might exist in different ways or not exist at all.
There's such a helpful description, and I'm just seeing lots of comments in the chat. Thank you, Lydia. I mean, so one thing I like to think about are moments where folks are, it's happening to folks, and then people are actively pitted against each other, right, from different places, right, where you sit in positional privilege or socially. And what a campaign that I've gotten to sometimes be a part of and just feel so inspired by, and I think can really sort of show us the way, is in California, the Domestic Workers Coalition, where the disability justice community and people with disabilities who require home supports have been deeply part of the work of getting domestic workers the rights they need. Because often those things are pitted against each other, right? Because again, everything is individualized. So, oh my God, I'm going to have to pay more if the domestic worker, the home care worker has rights. And therefore, how can we both win, right? And so there's this sense of like, we don't have enough for everyone, which is of course not true, but that's how it's framed, right? Total false scarcity. And so I was just thinking, I have this quote by Nikki Brown Booker, who is a, yes, she's the best. Nikki, who's a queer woman of color with disabilities in the Bay and a leader within the disability justice community, a person that I've learned and been politicized so much by. After there was a victory in California that improved the working conditions of domestic workers, she said, I also celebrate this as a victory for employers. Affirming the dignity of domestic workers affirms the work they do, and that elevates the dignity of all of us that rely on their support. And I just think that is that's the way we want to be building our culture, work together, economy, as not a zero-sum game, but one where when one group wins, we all win, and no one can get left behind. Because when some group gets left behind, actually we're all being left behind in some ways, although that impacts people way less the closer they get to sort of the positional privileges that they have.
I mean, it's like the quote from Audre Lorde, who many folks know primarily as a Black queer feminist, who is also disabled, which less people know but should know. And Audre Lorde said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. It doesn't exist. So when we talk about how to advance justice, labor justice for people who are predominantly low income, often immigrant, women of color, often disabled, who are doing care work, then we are also talking about how to enact and enable justice for people who actually need care of more care than perhaps just someone's friends might be able to provide on an occasional basis in order to be able to live life and sometimes to literally stay alive. We are talking about how all of our communities are deeply intertwined with one another. We do not get free unless we are all free.
Yeah, amen. I think the pandemic has obviously exposed so much of that, and I think a lot about how the talk about essential workers, right, and who are the essential workers, right? How clear was it made? And I think that intersectionality gets very clear, right? Women on the whole, if you look at just women, lost more jobs and now having a harder time getting back into the workplace. When you actually look deeper into those statistics, that is women of color primarily, right? And actually white women have been able to kind of mostly get back into the workplace, but women of color have been struggling much more. And at the same time, women of color are the ones that kept us going, primarily, and certainly in certain cities. I'm in New York. That is primarily immigrant women, women of color, queer folks who kept us going, who fed us, who cared for folks, who put their lives on the line every day. And for like, it's as if like the country moved on, right? We're like, oh, there's no pandemic anymore. But the realities for that group remain. And I'm one of the, I think so often we don't hear about the smaller wins that people have, and I love that Kate started by asking what are the small victories, because we're kind of programmed to see the negative. But earlier in the year in New York, the excluded workers who were not included in the funding, the federal aid funding that then the states were getting, those excluded workers went on hunger. I mean, they organized, they protest, and then they went on hunger strike, primarily women of color, leading, right? And then with support, because a hunger strike requires so much support. And they were on a hunger strike for many, like dozens of days. And then they won that fund for all excluded workers. And that just makes me think about also that the work we're doing, that was excluded fund workers. Today, literally like an hour ago, the taxi workers in New York, again, primarily immigrants, primarily folks of color, they won after their own strike. And so, and that was really inspired and sort of following the lead of the excluded fund workers. And so this is the part where, like, in this work also, our power, we only have power when it is collective power. And when the people closest to the pain are guiding us and sort of leading us and telling us what it is that they need. They didn't just need a march. This was life and death for them, right? And so they had a hunger strike and they won. But that's unfortunately just one, it's a small victory, but it's an amazing victory and should inspire us and demonstrate to us like how much we have to fight to just get basic dignity for like taking care of us.
Right. And, you know, that's one thing that I really want us to hone in on, that when I talk about disability justice and developing a clear disability justice analysis in our work to inform us and to guide us, I mean both an analysis of what are the harms, what is wrong, what is fucked up, what bullshit is there, how are racism and ableism and gender-based oppression all tied together? How does the patriarchy depend on ableism? How does capitalism depend on ableism? How does ableism depend on white supremacy? We need to understand that. And disability justice is also about visioning our future. What can be in our future? What does justice actually look like? What does freedom look like? What would it mean for us to actually be able to guarantee and to ensure that all people can be treated fairly in our labor, and that our labor is not tied to our ability to access healthcare or food or housing, that all people are able to receive the care that they need, and that people who are doing care work are also always treated justly. And a lot of people might look at me and think, okay, that is totally unrealistic. We are so far from that right now. Look at the state of the world right now and how awful things are. True. And if we're not thinking about what we are imagining for the future, then what are we working toward? You know, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is an abolitionist thinker, says about abolition is not a project of absence, but of presence. And I think the same thing, right, about our work for labor justice, our work in feminism, our work for disability justice. Our work isn't just about what we want to disappear and what we want to end, but it's also what do we want to bring about. So yeah, by all means, let's celebrate the victories that we can, even if they're small, wherever we can get them. And let's think about what we are fighting for. What are we trying to build? How can we manifest and sustain that future now?
I think about that. So like I said, I've been blessed to, because of my work with domestic worker movement, to actually in that way encounter the disability justice movement, folks like Nikki, folks like Jessica Lehman and others, and to really be deeply, deeply educated and sort of notice how I felt short and the harm that like that's like a deep psychic, but somatic meaning like in the body harm when we have bought into sort of the ableist ideas that our bodies are meant to be a very particular way, that we're meant to be independent beings and do everything for ourselves, that what we produce is connected to our values. And I think, the outcome, I saw someone say it in the chat, is that people, like people in nursing homes were just like, I mean, I say it right, like when Governor Andrew Cuomo put folks with COVID in nursing homes, he was responsible for the deaths of over 15,000 seniors and folks who needed care and support. whatever your feelings about actual nursing homes are. But the point being that
they're abusive and need to be closed.
Yeah, lots of feelings. And right, that was just an idea that some people are, disposable, right? And there was certain campaigns of that was like no body is disposable during those early days of the pandemic, because that
the website still exists, nobodyisdisposable.org, and you should check it out.
And it's just, but it's so fundamental, and you see it. And I think we believe, especially like myself as a white cis straight woman, right, who has ascended class-wise, and therefore like I am close in positional privilege, and it's easy to believe that you will somehow escape the harm of that ableism. But when my dad got sick with ALS, the lie of independence and that your body is going to be like yours to control forever, that lie hurt him more than the ALS did. Needing help, asking for help.
Right? We are taught to be so afraid of even the possibility of disability that for those people who become disabled, who were not disabled at all before, or become disabled in new ways that are different from how they were disabled before, like we experience anger, grief, rage, because that's what society teaches us, that to be or to become disabled is an automatically degrading experience. To need care is a degrading experience. And that is literally what, Fiona Kamari Campbell calls internalized ableism, the tyranny within. It's the tyranny within, that we are taught to internalize the idea and invest in the mythology that our personhood is predicated on our supposed independence, right? And that is just, it is unsustainable and it's unrealistic, because some disabled activists will say if you live long enough you'll become disabled. I don't agree with that. I think if you live long enough there's a higher chance that you'll become disabled, and if you weren't yet already disabled. But whether or not you personally become disabled, everybody has needs. Everybody needs care in some way, but we're just not ready to acknowledge that because we are so invested in our ableist thinking that needing care of any kind is automatically shameful and degrading. And in reality, we all need care in different ways. There shouldn't be anything degrading about that. And if, we want to be good, kind neighbors and community members, which literally is a core part of justice, to live in a state of justice means that we care for and are kind with one another, then we should be able to take care of each other. We should care about making sure that everyone has their needs met. And yet we don't. And, just on that note, as you mentioned about nursing homes, right? Like nursing homes are another form of institution. Institutions are a form of incarceration. And we know that the people that are most likely to be incarcerated or institutionalized are disabled, queer and trans, Black, brown, and Native folks. And so we need to be clear too, that when we talk about what does it mean to be able to receive care, we need to underscore the reality that because of ableism, we're taught to believe in this country, and not just in the United States, but other countries too, that care for disabled people must be coercion, that care must be control, and that to be institutionalized is a form of care, when in reality, it is not care, it's violence. And so when we think about what is care justice for disabled folks, then we need to ask, what does it mean to dismantle all of the forms of violence and trauma and abuse that masquerade as care or as treatment or as support, but are not?
Yeah, I want to make sure that we have time to also, I'm just trying to see if there are questions for folks, but I think about that a lot, in part from both my the care that I provided my dad that we didn't in the UK, when an austerity like meaning like an economy that was devaluing care and pulling money away from especially what's called their social care in order to put it tax cuts for the rich. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And that I had no choice, that my dad had to be in a care home. He needed two people to take him out of, and
the government does. It incentivizes us to further perpetuate and uphold those systems in those spaces. And so it is, again, it's a question not about individual people, and it never is, right? Like that's a mistake that oppression wants us to think, is that oppression is the fault of individual people. Individual oppressed people didn't try hard enough, or individual privileged people are evil. And in reality, it's a systemic and structural problem. For a lot of disabled people who have mental illnesses, right, it's the same situation. If you're experiencing a mental health crisis right now, your only option in most cases is go to the ER, and you're probably going to be committed, right? That's your only option in many cases because there isn't funding available to support peer-run respite, to support community-based programs, to support peer-based warm lines and hotlines that don't call police, that don't involve carceral authorities, because the system is designed that way. So, I just, want to be really clear about that. That's not in any means a condemnation of you or of your family. This is a condemnation of the system that forced your father to be in that position.
Right. And it's so important. I felt so lucky because I'd been working with folks in the disability justice movement and with domestic workers to like know that, right? And I just saw it, it tore apart my dad, but it also tore apart so many other people who were in the care home and had that's what they call nursing homes in England. And I think social care home. Yes. Yes, there's lots going on there. I'm going to let that be the last word, and thank you all. I know we didn't get to so many questions, but we are at our limit. So hopefully the conversation will continue. Women's March will sort of support these conversations continuing. Thank you all so much for your attention and for the comments and for the deep thinking and for the asking of things that you might not have known about, because I also do like terms, because I think a lot of ableism is pretending we know things, forces us to pretend we know things we don't, and that keeps leaving people behind. So thank you all.